afternoon. My name's Amy Ingalls. I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on redistricting in Illinois. The University of Illinois Extension provides practical, research-based information and programs to help individuals, families, farms, organizations, businesses, and communities in Illinois. The University of Illinois Extension offers a variety of programming from youth development, horticulture, small farms, local foods, nutrition, wellness, to community and economic development. The University of Illinois Extension's Community and Economic Development team is pleased to partner with the University of Illinois Institute of Government and Public Affairs to bring you this programming today. There are about 15 University of Illinois Extension, Community, and Economic Development educators located throughout the state to work to foster community leadership, facilitate community planning, assist business retention and development, stimulate community and economic development. So to contact a CED educator near you, visit extension.illinois.edu. And I just want to thank our local government team, Corey Buttery, Kathy Brown, and Ken Larimer, for working diligently behind the scenes to help make this webinar series possible. We have a really great program for you today, so please just let me introduce our first presenter and co-moderator. Dr. Christopher Mooney is the director of the University of Illinois Institute for Government and Public Affairs. Welcome, Dr. Mooney.
Thanks a lot, Amy, and thanks for having us. We certainly enjoy our partnership with U of I Extension in this series and find it very valuable. Let me start off by saying that the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, or IGPA, is the University of Illinois' public policy think tank with a focus on the state of Illinois. We help bring the resources of the university to bear on the public problems of the state. We've done 3 other webinars with the Extension since May on the fiscal crisis, and you can find these on the Extension website. Today we're looking at a very different issue, and that is legislative redistricting. You know, Amy, it looks like I'm not in as a moderator, so you're going to have to advance the
Well, it looks like we might have lost your mic too, so let me work on that and get your voice back.
How about that?
Here we go. We got it.
Okay. Yeah, that happened when we slipped over. Okay, so here we go. As I said, we have done 3 of these webinars before on the fiscal crisis, and then we're doing this one today on the legislative redistricting. Every 10 years, sure, summer, fall, spring, the states and local government entities have to redraw their legislative district maps. This is primarily a state function constitutionally, but it's often delegated to local governments. The states are required to do this by the Constitution, by the U.S. Supreme Court, with the idea being that this will ensure or at least help promote fair representation on a numerical basis. So in essence, that each district in a legislative body has basically the same number of residents in every other district in that body. You know, people move around, so districts have to be updated often. And since 1962, a series of key Supreme Court decisions required that this be done every time we have a new canonical count of where people live, and that is the decennial U.S. Census. Now, in recent years, good government reformers have managed to put redistricting reform on the policy agenda in several states, even though it's a tough one to sell to the average voter who finds it arcane and not really that pertinent to his or her life. Given the inherent conflicts of interest with office holders and the drawing of their own districts, the reform activity has been especially heavy in states that regularly use the direct initiative, and we saw that just recently in Illinois, we're not a heavy user of the direct initiative by any means, but the Yes for Independent Maps, this reform group, they pushed this remap reform in the past spring. They tried to be able to get it on the ballot in Illinois. Now today, we're going to talk about redistricting at 3 levels. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about sort of the 50,000-foot view of redistricting processes around the country. Brian Gaines will then look at some of the impacts, potential impacts of the 2011 map in Illinois, especially focusing on the congressional level and the upcoming election. And then Rick Winkle will talk about the actual hands-on process of redistricting from his very unique perspective as a person who's gone through the process on the inside, both at the state and local levels. Okay, so let's think about a 50-state perspective. When thinking about how to do something better, it's always helpful to understand the options and examples of how, in this case, other states redraw their districts. Is a good place to look for reform options. Not that we couldn't do something entirely new, but you know, this is a complicated process, and new things are fraught. And if we look to the other states, those processes have been sort of vetted. There are 2 basic categories of redistricting institutions. One of them are the mechanisms by which the maps are drawn, and these are usually what's discussed when talking about redistricting reform, but also the criteria by which map drawers assess their potential maps are also set in policy sometimes, and they vary considerably from state to state. So I'm going to talk about them. And in fact, I'm going to talk about redistricting criteria first. But when I say criteria, I mean the standards by which an offered set of maps is judged. And these can be informal, traditional, self-serving. You know, for example, a lawmaker might judge a map based on whether he is more likely to get reelected under it, or a party official might judge it based on what she expects the expected partisan outcomes to be. But there are also policy-based formal criteria that must be taken into account when drawing maps if they're established in policy. And these can be changed, of course, by policymakers as they so desire. Now, first of all, the U.S. Supreme Court, since the 1960s, has weighed in on the issue of redistricting, and they've laid out 3 criteria that all states and local policymakers must follow. Equal population, basically, again, that the districts are substantially equal in population. There's different tolerance for inequality at different levels, but you know, basically what we're talking about here are districts need to be equal in population. Contiguity, that is, districts, all the land mass of the districts have to be touching one another, you know, unless you have an island in your district. And race is another question of criteria that the redistricting, that the Supreme Court has weighed in on. First of all, maps cannot purposely disadvantage a racial minority. That's pretty clear. But the court has also held that race can't be the overriding criterion for maps. There's a fair amount of ambiguity over time here, and conflict, sort of Full Employment Act for lawyers, I think, on the issue of race and redistricting. Not to mention political scientists who do redistricting consulting. But you know, and perhaps surprisingly for some, the Supreme Court has said that political advantage is a criteria. Is okay to take into account as long as it doesn't violate some of these other ones. So they have not said that you can't look at political outcomes. Okay, now the states, you know, there's a level of government with the constitutional responsibility for elections in most election law, and they have established a variety of criteria to, in policy, to whether map is good in some sense. And there are 6 of them that are sort of the traditional or main ones, or that have the most usage among the states. So I'll just walk through these. First of all, 44 states have established in public policy and statute a rule that local boundaries must be followed to the extent possible. County boundaries, municipal boundaries. The idea here is that legislative boundaries that match other political boundaries with which voters are already familiar will enhance accountability and voter awareness and understanding in the legislative elections and so forth. Compactness is another one. 36 states say that the districts ought to be compact. The establishment of this criterion speaks directly to the complaint that gerrymandered legislative districts tend to be spindly, sort of oddly shaped pieces of land. It's sort of a face validity thing. If the districts are compact, they look less like somebody is trying to pull a fast one, I guess. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, VRA is a federal law that prohibits racial discrimination in voting procedures, including redistricting. 27 states have seen fit to require that their congressional legislative districts meet VRA standards, even though, because it's federal law, all states have to do it. But 27 states have codified this themselves. Communities of interest and the preservation of communities of interest as a criterion is a relatively new legal concept and criterion in legislative districting. One definition of definition of communities of interest is, quote, when residents share substantial cultural, economic, political, and social ties, close quote. And the idea here is that preserving communities of interest in a legislative district can enhance representation by making political interests and the policy interests of legislators' constituents more homogeneous. 13 states suggest or hold that the preservation of the previous district's core is desirable, so the idea here is when new districts are similar as possible to the old ones, both incumbent lawmakers and voters know each other better, which allows for better informed citizens, better representation, more accountability. On the other hand, 12 states prohibit the protection of incumbents as a consideration in the map, so that shouldn't be an issue in these 12 states. Basically, they establish this criterion in recognition of the basic conflict of interest for legislators when they have a hand in drawing their own districts. Obviously, this one has probably a pretty direct impact, conflict with the previous one, and it's certainly the case that there's lots of overlap and conflict among these various criteria, and so getting them a particular set of maps to match all these criteria, if they're so established in policy, is not an easy task. Now, there has been some study of the impacts of these criteria. For example, there was a couple of U of I grads actually did a study recently on of all the impacts of these criteria on race, ethnic minority, racial minority representation, and they found that only compactness as a criteria has an impact here. And another study showed, for example, that the more of these that a state has on the books, whether they're whichever they are, the more of them there are that increases competition, probably because it makes political gerrymandering more difficult. And having them codified and followed also can sometimes decrease litigation because it provides a rationale for map choices that are made. Okay, now onto redistricting mechanisms. Mechanisms here, I'm talking about the actual policymaking process that the states use to propose and approve their maps. And there's two major categories and 6 subcategories. The major categories are the legislative process, and some 37 states use the legislative process to set their maps out, and 13 states use commissions of some sort. Really, for the most part, I'll go through these, but I'll say at the end that there's less difference here than really meets the eye in terms of the impacts. Now, among the 37 states that use their legislative process, 20 of them use the straight-up normal legislative process. The maps go through like a regular bill. The governor has to approve, or maybe override the veto, or whatever. Another 2 states use the normal legislative process, except they cut the governor out. And so this probably even exacerbates the conflict of interest problem, because if legislators are drawing their own maps and the governor doesn't even have a hand in it, that's possibly a fox guard in the hen house sort of thing, at least some would argue. Now 11 states, including Illinois comes in here, use a backup commission. That is, if the legislature fails to decide on a map and the process doesn't work for whatever reason, you know, what would happen in the next election? Election is coming. You can't compel the legislature to act. You need districts, and the Supreme Court says you can't use the old districts. So what it'll be? These 11 states, they have a backup commission, which will then, you know, at some date when the legislature has enacted, they will take over and draw the maps. And you know, as a side note, the 22 states above here, and in fact, actually, the 26 states, other than these 11, they also have a default backup mechanism, but in their case, it's the courts, and it's not codified, but that's just what happens. The courts take over if the legislature can't get it done. Finally, in the legislative process, you have 4 states that have an advisory commission set up in advance of the legislature taking a look at this. And you know, the idea, you know, whether the advice is taken varies considerably. Iowa falls into this category. It is very much a staff-driven process. Iowa is often held up as sort of by reformers as a sort of golden ideal of redistricting in the country because the staff do it. They're not allowed to take into account political or incumbent locations. And the legislature basically rubber stamps more or less what the staff do in the end. On the other hand, this is not the mechanism per se that does the job, because New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland also have this advanced advisory commission, and they're not, to my knowledge, ever held up as the ideal of redistricting reform. Now, the 13 other states have commissions of some sort. The first kind is a bipartisan commission in 11 states. Members are selected for these in various ways. If what you want to do is purge political influence from the redistricting process, these bipartisan commissions are largely toothless, as I mentioned in a minute. The thing that's really different here are these independent commissions, and there's only 2 states that do this, and they're both very new. Basically, with the independent commission, you get a process established that purges, or tries to purge in some sense, the political and office holder influence on the process. This starts in Arizona adopts this reform in the 90s and used it for the first time in 2001. California did it a decade later, and so Arizona's done it twice under this process, and California once. The Illinois initiative that just failed was more or less based on the California and Arizona experience of an independent commission. Now, the impacts of these mechanisms are pretty straightforward. Under the ones that work on the legislative process, no matter how they do it, if you get unified government, you're going to get a partisan gerrymander. If you have divided government, you're going to get an incumbent protection gerrymander. And this varies in degree, but it's pretty strong, and they're pretty strong and consistent patterns here, unsurprisingly. The real exception here is Iowa, and that's just because they're Iowa. Now, in terms of the commissions, the bipartisan and partisan commissions, you get the same results as in the legislative process. If it's bipartisan, it's going to be an incumbent protection gerrymander. If it's partisan, it's going to be a partisan gerrymander. The independent commissions, Arizona and California, again, the unique ones, it's too early really to tell with certainty what's going to happen with these things, but they look promising. And for example, in California, for example, after the 2001 redistricting, which was a partisan gerrymander for the Democrats, throughout the decade of the 2000s, 99% of incumbents who ran were reelected, and there were 0 party changes across legislative districts, and that includes Congress, and that's a lot of districts in California. On the other hand, in 2012, under this new system, already the new maps put various incumbents in districts together and looked like some more competition. You know, the Republicans still cried foul that this was a partisan gerrymander, but it sure was a lot less so than the previous one. Okay, next we're going to move on. Brian Gaines come and speak about the impact of redistricting in Illinois. Brian is a professor of political science at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and he is a joint appointment with IGPA. So, Brian?
All right, I think I'm on. Thank you, Chris. There's a little blurb about me, but I'll skip this and get straight to redistricting. This is as a kind of context, this is a picture of the size of midterm losses. Midterm elections, the 2 years after a presidential election, are characterized most of the time by the president's party losing seats. This is 1946 to the present. What you see at a glance is the largest midterm swing in percentage terms in this whole period was the last one. 2010 was a landslide or a tsunami, choose your metaphor. A very bad election for Democrats, who of course occupied the White House. But 2006 was a very bad election for Republicans. It's looking at the size of this bar, they lost proportionally fewer seats, but this is one of 2 elections in a row, along with the following presidential election, where they, having had control of the House since 1994, lost it. And right before that is this anomaly of the only 2 midterm gains in the series, both very small, but the fact that the president's party didn't lose seats twice had political scientists scratching their head wondering if the midterm loss anomaly was dead, and we had 2 very big ones. So going into 2014, most people would say they expect the Democrats to lose some seats. And most of the political scientists who spend their time arguing about exactly how many seats and where and why and so on, we will focus on essentially national conditions, the fairly low approval rating for the president and to some extent the exposure of the president's party. Democrats have a relatively small number of U.S. House seats at the moment because they're in the minority and they had this bad awful result in 2010. But there won't be a great deal of attention in the people who are just trying to figure out how many seats we lost to redistricting. But if you could look state by state, then the redistricting effects will be much larger. So I'm going to focus largely on Illinois, but I'll say a little bit more about other states as well. Or, the national picture. If you looked at, there are lots of forecasters out there who are telling you what to expect from the election. Real Clear Politics is one that's essentially poll-based, collecting all the polls they can get from different races. How many races for the U.S. House are at this point somewhat suspenseful? They've got it at about 10%, these middle ones. The Tossups, 17 seats they think right now. That's 4% of the total. 3% on either side that are leaning to the Republican or the Democrat, but at this point these are fairly close races and the polls are close, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that it's hard to predict who will win. That's 10%, so that's about a little more than 40 seats. Contrast that with senators and governors who compete in states and there's no redistricting, and we're looking at about 30 or 40% of those races being either at the toss-ups, where at this point the polls essentially show a tie, or the lead is so small that they're willing to call it only a leaning lead for one way or the other. That contrast makes people think that there's something about the House that means it's very insulated from competition, and the top suspect generally is redistricting. It must be drawing these districts. Chris just laid out the process. It's done state by state, in every state except for those that have only one U.S. House district where there's no redistricting to be done. Those are the small states: Vermont, North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Delaware, forgetting a couple. Vermont, I said Vermont. In any case, other than those, anywhere you've got at least 2 seats, you've got to draw some lines, and it must be in the drawing of the lines that you end up with hardly any competition compared to the statewide races. We have districts drawn as for the General Assembly as well. So in the bottom here, there aren't enough polls at the state House or state Senate level for anybody like Real Clear Politics or the New York Times Nate Silver-driven site to be making predictions. But if I do a rough guess at how many really close races there are going to be in the state Senate this year, out of the 19 that are up, I have it 11%. It could be a little higher. It's not anywhere near 30 or 40. For the House, I didn't try to make these fine distinctions in the middle, but I did just count the ones where there's nobody running from one of the parties that are utterly safe, and that's a quarter of the seats here, almost 40% there. So you got about 2/3 of the seats where there's absolutely no suspense. Again, there are districts drawn here, so you might think that must mean this is a function of redistricting. And I want to say yes and no. Yes, there's no question that a lot of these districts are drawn with expressly political purposes, and I'll dwell on that in the case of the Illinois House, or the U.S. House races. But the no part is 2 points here. The second one, the clustering of partisan types ensures many safe seats. Think about the counties. The counties turn out to be less competitive than the states that they constitute, or the country as a whole. And the county lines are not drawn for political purposes. It just happens that people who tend to vote Republican and Democratic also tend to be somewhat segregated in where they live. So no matter how you draw the districts, you end up with less competition in districts than in the states in which those districts are drawn, and that's going to be roughly speaking, more true the more districts are drawn. A state like Maine that has 2 seats can have 2 seats that look a lot like Maine. Big states like California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, Ohio that have more than 15 or so, you end up having districts that look not too much like each other and less like the state as a whole. So that's my redistricting isn't the whole story. That's part of my I wouldn't call it a rebuttal, but qualification of these redistricting, the reason there are so few close races. The other one, the first bullet point here, is that Chris just talked about 2 kinds of gerrymanders: incumbent protection acts that are basically designed in a bipartisan way to help all the incumbents stay in office, and partisan gerrymanders. When a party is picking the lines and its purpose is to maximize the number of seats it wins, it doesn't destroy competitiveness entirely. It skews the races, but it necessarily makes relatively close districts, and then partisan gerrymanders trying not to make them too close, but that are won by it. And what the key to partisan gerrymanders is to make sure the other party wastes a lot of votes. So you want the other party, if you're a Democrat drawing a map, you want Republican districts that are extremely safe, where a lot of Republican votes pile up and are essentially wasted on very, very big margins, but you want closer Democratic margins. So in fact, partisan gerrymanders, though, they are an affront to democracy in the sense that they're expressly designed to produce an outcome, and in some regards to thwart voters' intentions, are also not anathema to competitiveness. So how would I go about trying to demonstrate where there's been gerrymandering of any kind? If I look historically at the Illinois House, this is the sort of data I would use. Here are 4 decades, 4 different maps. The cumulative voting was an entirely different vote system used in the Illinois House until 1980. The height here is just on the vertical axis, what proportion of the seats were won by Democrats, ignoring the vote. And there were Republican majorities and Democratic majorities in this period, and they swung back and forth. Cumulative voting was eradicated by our current governor starting in '82. So from here on, they're more familiar first past the post elections, the most votes wins. The Democrats drew this map, and they did really well. The Republicans drew the map from the '92 to 2000 period, and they didn't. This state has become more democratic over this era, and they didn't win and dominate. They won the control of the House just once. But you see that the Democratic seat shares are smaller than they were in the prior map. Democrats drew the next one from 2002 to 2010, and again, the Democrats' shares rose relative to the Republican. So this figure on the left is sort of indirect evidence that there's something to the map making that's determining how many seats are won by which party. On the right, I'm just comparing the aggregate vote and the aggregate seat shares. And at a glance, the point is the red dots here are a map Republicans drew, and we're looking at points that are on the line or below it, where the Republicans are getting about in the cases of the points right on the line, about the seat share you'd expect from a fair map. And if they're below, they're getting more than they deserve. And all the points above, which are drawn in blue, are outcomes where the Democrats drew the map. And in general, they're getting more seats than a larger share of the seats than they got votes, and that again is indirect evidence that the map is favoring them in some way. 2012 is this circle that doesn't look like it's extremely biased compared to other results. It's the only result we have on the new map so far. That's the Illinois House. Let me spend the rest of my time on the U.S. House. And here's my point again, that in fact you can get close races with a map that can quite reasonably be called unfair. Here are the Illinois House results from 2002, 4, 6, 8, and 10 on a map that was. Now, I said that the Illinois House was a Democratic-drawn gerrymander. The Illinois U.S. House map, the congressional map, was, I think most people would agree, a bipartisan Incumbent Protection Act. Democrats and Republicans drew it together. The legislature passed it after a bipartisan vote. And there weren't a lot of close races, and the competition early on was pretty close. In 2002, there were 10 Republican seats, 9 Democratic. It flipped 2004, still 10 and 9 in 2006. Then we had a very good year for the Democrats, and they end up in a 12-7 advantage, and then it flips to 12-7 for the Republicans going into in 2010. But Democrats controlled both houses of the General Assembly and the governorship, so they got to draw the next map. What they drew produced a 12-6 advantage, and we're down to 18 because the state grew slowly enough it lost a seat. That looks like a big swing, and that looks like a gerrymandering kind of result. There were a lot of close races. This middle dashed line shows the races that were between 45 and 55%, what political scientists think of as a close race. There were more close races in 2012 than in most of these prior years, but in the end, they all broke in the Democratic favor, and that looks like a finger on the scale. How did they do it? Well, they did a couple of things, but one of the key things they did is draw districts where Republican incumbents had fewer familiar voters than Democrats. So the vertical axis in this figure is what proportion of a new district is taken from the incumbent's old district. Incumbents develop popularity. They like to have the same voters looking at them each time. And the Republican seats are almost all lower than the Democratic seats in how much of the district on the new map consisted of the district that the incumbent represented before. This is a one-time kind of effect. You draw a new map and cut away the familiar voters for Republicans if you can, if you're trying to hurt them. Democrats did this. They did it very skillfully. All of these hollow circles are cases where Republican incumbents were defeated, and that's how we went from a 12-7 Republican advantage to 12-6 for the Democrats. The 2 points per 16 are two of the Republican incumbents that ended up in the same district and competing in the primary because neither of them had more than 40% of his old district in any new district. So that part is essentially breaking the personal vote. The other half of this, the horizontal axis, is how safe is this district? And for safety here, I'm using the presidential 2008 vote. So I'm comparing the new map and the old map in terms of where, what proportion of the voters in a district supported Barack Obama in the presidential election in 2008. And I'm comparing the even both times so that I'm looking at the same metric. And this quick story about the old and new map here is there were 8 seats that were in what we think of as a competitive range in terms of presidential vote. So these are seats where both Republicans and Democrats were winning, or there were some close races. And that's more than a 55% presidential vote for Obama because this is his home state. So there's a natural advantage for him. So it isn't that it was a close presidential election, it's just that with that kind of presidential vote share in the district was close in congressional terms. On the new map, there are only 2 seats in that range. And the others have been pushed one extra to the Republican side, but mostly to the Democratic side. So not only in terms of breaking normal vote, but in terms of the breaking personal vote, but also the normal voting habits of the districts, the new map was drawn in such a way that it should be harder for Republicans to win seats. The numbers here are the races that anybody thinks are close. I said Real Clear Politics thinks there are some close races, and not a lot, but 10% of the U.S. House races. 2 of them, of the toss-ups, are Illinois, the 13th and the 10th. And the 10th is out here where it's breaking this prediction that you can use the Obama vote share to identify a close district. The 10th is essentially defying that, the assumption I'm making that we can use presidential vote as a proxy for the normal vote. The 12th and the 17th are leaning districts. So there are 4 races in Illinois that Real Clear Politics thinks are somewhat suspenseful. And in that respect, this isn't an election where competition has been destroyed or killed, but it is an election where the map was clearly skillfully drawn to deliver a particular outcome, and that is more Democratic seats. Last point, I use the term toss-ups because that's what Real Clear Politics calls them. Are these things really toss-ups? Can we look at these and say one of these, coin flip kind of situation, one will go to the Dems, one to the Reaps? Well, actually, the toss-up terminology is a little misleading. If you look at what happened in 2012, 10 of the 11 toss-up states in the presidency went to the Democrats. 6 of the 7 U.S. Senate seats went to the Democrats. They won 21 of the 33 U.S. House seats. So these aren't really toss-ups in the true sense of a fair coin. It's more like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, the Tom Stoppard play, where at the beginning they're flipping heads and they flip and flip. And in fact, they get 78 heads in a row. And one of them says, what about the suspense? And I says, what suspense? He says, well, it's an even chance. These toss-up races probably aren't an even chance. If this turns out to be a very good year for Republicans, they could end up winning both of these, maybe even one of these seats.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Brian.
But the bottom line
Let
is
me
still
just say before we
carefully
that we're going to have time for questions at the end. So if you type them in the chat room at the bottom of bottom left of your screen, we'll get to those when Rick is done. Okay, so Rick Winkle is the director of the Office of Public Leadership at IGPA. He's a former state senator and state representative from the Champaign area, and he's got a very unique perspective on redistricting. So, Rick?
Chris, thank you. You've heard a very good background of what redistricting really is. I'm certainly not going to try to amplify or to educate you as an expert in redistricting. I was asked instead if I would make some remarks about my experience as a state representative, then a state senator, and also I started out in the county board and had some recent experience in county board redistricting. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about redistricting from a practical sense. Money, politics, that's the heart and blood of the process. When you talk about reform, you have to talk about those things because they have more to do than anything else with how congressional, state senate, state house, and county board districts, how they're drawn. As we've heard, the basic principles, don't want to go through all of those, we want equal population, etc., compactness, contiguousness, all these things are pretty well set and certainly have an impact on the process. Now, many states do establish additional rules and criteria, prerequisites, such as requiring districts respect integrity of existing geographic, political entities. Illinois doesn't have any of these types of rules. So are there any problems with the way we go about it? From my experience, just kind of reiterating what you've already heard, I guess, a little bit, but some of the redistricting problems, yes, it's too partisan. You look at how we do it in Illinois, Chris, Professor Mooney has outlined, we've got a tiebreaker mechanism where we have a bipartisan commission. If the state legislature can't pass a bill in both chambers and get it signed by the governor, then it fails and it goes to the bipartisan commission, and it's evenly split Republican and Democrat. If they can't reach an agreement, then only in Illinois, as far as I know, the Secretary of State will reach into a hat and pull a tiebreaker, either pulling out a Republican person for the commission or a Democrat. They will then join the commission. Whoever wins that draws the map. Now in 1991, 2001, no bipartisan agreement reached. We had to use a tiebreaker. So one party single-handedly draws those maps. Party leaders use their power to gerrymander to favor their political party. Redistricting, as already been outlined, is a once-in-a-decade process. So it has long-term implications, and it results in safe incumbent districts potentially for 10 years. In 2011, there was no need for bipartisan agreement. One party ruled and was in complete control of both chambers and had the governor's office. The process, when it's controlled by legislators, my experience is legislators, this will be shocking, I'm sure, but legislative leaders use their power to control the redistricting process. As a result, when you think about it, step back, look at it, legislators end up selecting the citizens they will represent rather than the other way around that we've come to think of in a democracy with elections. So the other problem is that there's no transparency. Illinois residents have no effective influence in behind the doors redistricting processes like we have in Illinois. Here's the result. Well, okay, so if this might upset some on one side and maybe not, but it just really depends who's in control. If Republicans are in control, yes, Republicans draw the map and the Democrats suffer. But they are skillfully done, especially now with the computer programs that we have. They can be almost downright diabolical in their effect for keeping a party in control or keeping incumbents in place. So are there alternative approaches to redistricting? Should we consider alternative approaches? Yes, we should definitely try. Iowa's been mentioned. Professor Mooney described that. They've got a legislative services agency. It's staffed by nonpartisan types. They typically draft bills and research for Iowa legislature, but they're also assigned the task of coming up with a new map. So we looked at that and we said in Illinois, in Champaign County locally, where I'm from, they said, well, the county board looked at Iowa and said, that looks like a pretty good idea. So in 2011, actually March 2010, they adopted a resolution, resolution number 7307, signed March 8, 2010. And in 2011, the Champaign County Board appointed the Champaign County Redistricting Commission. It's based on the Iowa statute, used objective the statistical tests, the kind of statistical tests that Professor Mooney was outlining. Process was, gosh, you know, that sounds like a good thing, a good reform. I was asked, and I said, sure, I'd be glad to participate, end up as chairman of this, this Champaign County Redistricting Commission. So what did we look at? Using the Iowa statute, we looked at, and this is all in House Resolution 7307. You can Google Champaign County Clerk and look up Resolution 7307 and find all these definitions. We looked at the ideal equal district, population, deviation, mean deviation, overall range, smallest majority measurement. What I'm trying to say here is there were objective criteria that we used. There's also, as has already been described here, non-population criteria, Voting Rights Act, constitutional requirements. We wanted to maintain communities of interest, groups having shared interests or identity, compactness, make sure the shapes are, you know, as rounded and squarish as possible. Contiguous, districts are connected, and preservation of municipal, township, and precinct boundary lines. Now, for anybody listening and thinking, well, you know, I think they should all be perfectly square, we shouldn't divide towns, townships, and counties, and all that sort of thing, try it sometime. Go to the web, look up, there's plenty of software out there that's up and running on the web that you can use to try and draw your own political boundaries. It's hard. It's very difficult to do these things. So what we tried to do was, you know, and I said redistricting is the most political thing that you can possibly think of. Well, in Champaign County, with the resolution number 7307, we took politics out of it, no political factors. So we didn't take into account voting patterns, we didn't look at voting records, we didn't look at past election results, we didn't look at party affiliation, nor do we look at incumbency. Now, especially this last factor, incumbency, Professor Mooney mentioned in Iowa, yes, more or less the legislature rubber stamps whatever the commission there in Iowa does and will adopt it. Well, here in Champaign County, the Champaign County Board had to approve whatever it is the commission proposed. So that was lurking. So we did keep the process open to the public. We had transparency. We documented our criteria for how we created plans in individual districts. The software that we used was open, and you could come in and use it if you were in the public. There was a public terminal. We showed everybody the maps. We published them. Our minutes were recorded. You could listen to them on the web. We had all the data that we used that was available to the public. All this was available on our websites. So open meetings and plus public hearings, and if you couldn't come, you could find it in the on the website. So the process, which is also in resolution number 7307, as I talked about already, it was a professional, nonpartisan staff in Champaign County that did this for us at our direction, which is kind of, you know, that's just part of the process. You can have all the software you want, all the nonpartisan staff you want, but somebody still directs and somebody still has to put in the numbers and the criteria and all that sort of thing. So there becomes that element of doubt or perhaps mistrust in the process that somebody's wondering, you know, if you're not tinkering with it. But so there is, although objective statistical tests are used, there's some subjectivity. It was open to the public where we were constantly watched. We had 21 printed maps developed with summary statistics. The Commission used statistical information to weigh alternative maps. We narrowed it down. Again, a bit of subjectivity here. The Commission itself then went through the 21 maps, went down to 5 maps for further study. We took into account the voting age population, minority races for voting rights compliance. Commission instructed staff to make further revisions. We went down from 5 then to 3 maps, and ultimately the Commission adopted 1 map by a majority vote, split 7-4, and yes, 4 that voted against were with one party. Reality check. Okay. May 4, 2011, the Champaign County Board voted 15-12 party line vote to reject the first map. Okay, that was a blow. So we went back, regrouped. Redistricting Commission met, developed 3 new maps and submitted them to the Champaign County Board. We felt pretty good. You know, we listened, tried to adopt the criticisms. There's always things that you could do better, and so we tried. So 2 weeks later, about 2 weeks later, on May 19, 2011, Now this is from the News Gazette report. In a surprisingly swift vote Thursday night, Champaign County board members approved a new county board district map that had been submitted last week by the local chapter of the NAACP. Aha. The vote on the map, also effective in 2012 and expected to be in place for 10 years, came with virtually no discussion and by a show of hands, which took about 60 seconds by my recollection. There was no discussion, no debate, no presentation. County board chairman at the time said the vote was 15-11. All Democrats voted for the map except for one. Republicans made no effort to oppose the map. They didn't know it hit them. It happened so quickly, which was among the three that had been forwarded to the board by the county's independent redistricting commission. So what did we learn? We're not Iowa. Politics is very alive and well, thank you, here in Champaign County and in Illinois. We still need to do some reform. This was a very good experiment. A lot of thought, a lot of effort went into it. Still more work needs to be done, but it has to be embraced by the people and by the powers that be before it stands a chance of ever changing
now,
Chris, that's all I have.
Floor to questions. If you have questions, type them in the chat room, and Amy will read them out for us.
Here, I better click my talk button so you can hear me. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for some people to type in their questions, I do have a few that were presented to me earlier. So I will go ahead and get started with those. And I believe that this might be directed towards Dr. Gaines, but I'll open the floor up to whoever might want to address this question. And the question is, how can we draw a fair map? Why not just let a computer draw it? Why can Iowa do it, but Illinois can't? So let me open that question up to start with.
Well, I mean, this is Chris. I'll just say one of the things that's different between Iowa and Illinois is that we have a much more complicated demographic picture. Our population is concentrated in the Northeast and spread out in the South or everywhere outside of the Northeast. And our racial, the racial component of the demographics is also much more mixed than in Iowa, even though Iowa is changing in that respect to some extent. And probably the other point would be that political culture in Iowa seems to be less sympathetic towards corrupt practices or unethical or some conflicts of interest. They won't put up with that business over there, whereas in Illinois, it's not quite so. We're not quite so pristine, I suppose.
I can comment a little bit on the computer. The computer cuts both ways. It's become easier to draw maps for people who have necessary software, and for people who are particularly good at programming and skillful at doing it, it's easier in some respects to draw shrewd strategic maps that serve a particular political purpose, whether it's maximizing Republican seats or Democratic seats or helping all the incumbents of both parties. In some ways, I think the future of bringing computer technology into it to make them fairer is just to open up the process. The more transparency and the more maps that are part of the public debate, the less likely that we'll be looking only at a small set, all of which were produced with the same political purpose. And the holy grail for this area would be if somebody could draw effectively all possible maps and then say the map we're looking at on some particular criterion like competitiveness or number of Democratic seats is in the 70th percentile in terms of fairness or the 40th. That's impossible still. Nobody, no programmer out there has solved the problem of how to draw essentially all the maps. It's too hard mathematically. But there is constant progress, and I think technology, as I say, it's a two-edged sword. It helps the people who have a very express political purpose, but it also eventually will make it possible to have more people drawing maps, and as long as the process is transparent, that should lead to fairer outcomes.
Well, that kind of leads into our next question, which is about technology. And so we've made several advances in technology, mapping being one of them. But kind of bigger picture, how has technology changed redistricting over the years?
I'll start in on this, and Chris and Rick might want to jump in as well. Mostly it's in literally the drawing of the maps. There's an ongoing debate about whether the census has gotten more precise over years. Whether the census is, and can you make it more or less exact by having a statistical procedure to try to model errors in the census? That's not really a resolved debate. There are people on both sides. But I'd say the technology in terms of accounting people in the first place is a little murky. The technology for drawing lots and lots of maps that meet these criteria, all the ones that Chris listed, but most especially population equality and contiguity, that used to mean a lot of people sitting with drafting boards. I was on a Royal Commission in the late 80s, and I had transparencies and markers, and I had a computer too, but the computer wasn't doing the drawing. Now the computer, we can actually instruct computers to draw random maps. We can essentially we can see a lot more options quickly because it's the technology has made it a much less painful process. But it isn't at this point. Rick said there's stuff online, so lots of people can do it, but it's not as easy as it could be. It's still mostly the province of a few specialists.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Rick, have you seen a difference between the sort of, because you went through the process in 2001 and then again in 2011 in a different way. Did you notice any major differences over that decade?
Well, I think that Brian has outlined it very well. I mean, if you're in control of the process and now you have more sophisticated and better tools to more skillfully and artfully and almost, as I said before, diabolically craft the maps. I mean, yeah, they become extremely sophisticated in their approach. They're extraordinarily strategic in their motivation. It depends on who's instructing the software. It's not the software. There's no magic software out there that's going to draw maps for us. We have to be a little careful of that. There's two things about that. Do we want an information technocracy where IT is kind of ruling the world? I mean, for all you IT people, thank you. You do a great job. But I think that we have to be careful that there's still a subjective aspect of this. Somebody instructs the program, sets the parameters. The second thing is, and Brian, as Professor Gaines touched on this, it's the quality of the data. We can't just assume just because we're using census data that's the same census data that we got 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier in quality. Quality of data is an issue. And so as people manipulate the software, they can also manipulate the data. So we have to be very vigilant and watchful of this process, in my opinion. And I agree with Professor Gaines, the best antiseptic here, once again, like we talk in terms of campaign finance, I'll say it here too, transparency and public awareness and being involved and watching the process, that's the best disinfectant.
We have a couple questions here in the chat room, and so I'll go ahead and address those. How do we bring balance, this is from Kathy, how do we bring balance to the geography and population criteria implications both for rural downstate communities?
Well, the population criterion is supersedes all others, right? The Supreme Court, the original impetus for redistricting, mandatory redistricting in the Supreme Court decisions in the 60s was that some states hadn't redistricted in a long time, and so some districts were very small, which were in population, which primarily rural districts, and some districts were very large in population in a given chamber, and those were primarily urban districts. And so under that condition, the urban districts were put upon, the rural districts were much more powerful relative to their votes. And so the Supreme Court said we can't have that, everything ought to be equal, one man, one vote is what they call, the sort of this bumper sticker for it in those days. So you've got to have them equal, or at least very close to equal. And then geography, I assume that means something having to do with the boundaries, municipal boundaries. Then that and everything else has to come second. It's just one thing that highlights is the sort of inherent conflicts among of these criteria.
I'll modify that just a tiny bit to say that a peculiar aspect of it is population equality, and the courts insist on it to a ridiculous level of precision, but only at the time of the census. Then a decade passes and people move around in the districts very dramatically. I could imagine a court at some point deciding that there's no special, even though the census happens every 10 years, that there's enough movement within a decade that there ought to be more frequent redistricting. Second point is, who are we counting? At the moment, it's still all people. It's not on the near horizon, but it's still potentially possible. The courts could decide at some point that the constitutional language for the federal and the state cases is slightly ambiguous, and should the districting be based on total population or eligible voters? That would have a gigantic impact if it were ever changed. At the moment, though, it's equality of population, not eligible voters.
Okay, we have a question from Deb, and we got about 5 minutes left. So when redrawing precinct boundaries, what should we look for, ask for, rather than just accepting suggested boundaries from the clerk?
Why don't you pick that one up, Rick?
Well, at that level, what you try to do, I think, is you want to make sure that you don't cross village or city boundaries and that sort of thing in township. Try to keep communities of interest as intact as possible for the precincts. But honestly, I've never drawn precincts. I'm hesitating here because I'm not really sure how exactly that's been done, so I don't feel qualified to answer how it should be done, how to change it.
Okay. I think, Rick, you want to mute yourself? I think we're having, unless you, okay. One other good one, I think, maybe all three of you want to comment on this very briefly. We got a few more minutes. Reforms that Illinois should adopt. Any suggestions there?
Well, one thing I have suggested in the past is that we look more at these formal criteria because they are less threatening. If you go in and try to change the mechanisms, there are a lot of vested interests that will put that down, as we've just seen with the independent maps effort. But if in legislation one was to advocate for preserving the district's core when we do redistricting and helping preserve communities of interest and so forth, those might be harder to shoot down in their face. They're less directly impacting lawmakers' political interests, and so it might be easier to get through. And as research has shown, the more of these things that are established, the harder it is for any sort of hanky-panky to be pulled.
It wouldn't be a proper academic talk without some disagreement. So I think I'm less sanguine than Chris about the cumulative effect of having these constraints. Some of them are very hard to implement. Compactness constraints, basically saying the districts have to have nice, simple shapes. The courts sort of tie themselves in knots on this, and it's a hard problem to define well. I still think in the end, the key is having a truly independent commission. It's extremely hard to do, but Iowa established its by a unified Republican government that could have indulged in gerrymandering and chose to pass off the power. And we're waiting to see about the California and Arizona experiments, but I think they're interesting. In other countries, royal commissions in Britain, Canada, and Australia are pretty much regarded as being nonpartisan. I think it's difficult but possible that Illinois at some point could get a constitutional amendment passed. I'm not saying the fair map was perfect, but something that does establish a process that's more obviously a fair process.
Well, we're about out of time, and I really want to thank all of our speakers. It's been great having you here. It's great information. The IGPA's website is on your screen, Extension's website. We look forward to you coming back and possibly seeing some more upcoming series with Extension. And again, perhaps in the future, again, with some series with IGPA. We will send you a feedback evaluation, and thanks for participating. Have a great day, everybody.